Hello, welcome to the fourth segment of the 11th lecture on markets and globalization. And I'm going to move here to do a discussion of globalization and particularly of free trade and why you might have some ethical arguments in favor of free trade. And then maybe I will look at some criticisms thereof in the next segment. So there's several different ways of justifying free trade from our different ethical perspectives. As usual, we divide our ethical approaches into those that have to do with the nature of the agent, those that have to do with the principles that motivate the agent, and those that have to do with the outcomes of what the agent does. If you think of the character-based approach, one of the things that free trade does is it produces tolerance. As people get more and more contact with each other, they become more and more tolerant of one another, different cultures, different ways of being, different races, different ethnicities, all of these things. And free trade can contribute to a growth in tolerance. Tolerance is a good character trait and perhaps also leads to more in the way of world peace. Another view depends on people's rights. Taking from the principle-based view, we can talk about negative rights, liberties, the libertarian argument for free trade, and I'll discuss that in just a second. Then I will turn to utilitarian arguments for free trade, which depend on Ricardo's law of comparative advantage. It turns out that when people trade, even if one country is better at producing everything, the two countries can still gain from trade, which is an interesting result, and it means that we can maximize economic well-being, economic welfare, economic goods and services if we under free trade considerations. However, like all utilitarian arguments, there is often a problem with distribution, and this discussion will lead us to a notion thinking about distributive justice and look at another economics result that you're probably less familiar with, the factor proportions law, that shows that free trade will actually produce winners and losers and therefore raise considerations of distributive justice. All right, so first of all, let's look at the libertarian argument for free trade. It depends on this view that people have a natural right to own property. It's not a right that's given to them by a government, but a right that they have in the state of nature, the right that they have as a human being. It's like the way we use human rights to critique governments that don't respect human rights. Human rights precede, they dominate the concerns of governments to restrict them or whatever they have to do. One of those natural rights is a liberty to exchange. If you own something, you can buy and sell it. And therefore, government restrictions on free trade in domestic markets are illegitimate. Okay, that's where we got before. The big thing is that natural rights, being sort of human rights, not being bestowed by national governments, they don't stop at national borders. So therefore, any restriction on free trade in international markets is illegitimate, like quotas, tariffs, border closures, as are any attempts to rectify income inequalities, because they would necessarily infringe rights to property. Now, the problem with this argument is that in the actual world, it's only as good as the historical entitlement to the property that's being traded. And that's, of course, the problem, because yes, it's fine if maybe if things were worked out like Locke said they should, that people find unowned property and they acquire it by mixing their labor with it. But in actual fact, most of the things that people own have a nasty history, and that history may mean that they don't really have the natural rights to the property that they think they do. I mean, think for example of the interaction between Spain and Mexico in the 16th century. That was one of robbery and pillage. It wasn't one of respectful acquisition of land. But yet, property rights in nowadays, within the trade between Spain and Mexico, are based on those initial acquisitions, which were done by conquest, not by labor. All right, now I'm going to turn now then to this economic utilitarian argument, which is based on this idea that trade is a positive sum game. The same way that Jack and Jill can cooperate in the pin factory and perhaps trade pin heads for pins bodies, and come out ahead. The same thing can happen in free trade between nations. One nation can specialize in the thing that it has an advantage in. The other nation can do the same. Each nation can specialize in what it has, a thing which has what's called an absolute advantage, the thing that it does best, and which it can do better maybe than the other country. What's really interesting is that even if one country can produce everything more efficiently, there still can be gains from trade. There still can be gains from cooperation. Excuse me. For example, suppose that the USA, down here, if I can find it, can produce both corn and automobiles more cheaply than India. Ricardo says, this law of comparative advantage that I'm going to just talk about briefly, says that the USA can still gain from trade with India. Both countries can gain. And that's a utilitarian consideration because in the aggregate, spread over the two countries, it can be maximized by trade. Doesn't say anything about the distribution, mind, and we'll get back to that. So one country has an absolute advantage if it can produce something more cheaply than the other country. So in this example, hither on an acre of land, hither can produce 5.6 tons of corn, 8 tons of beans, and so hither has the absolute advantage in corn. Yon is the other way around, can produce beans more efficiently than corn, and if the two trade, they can end up ahead. Now we're familiar with that. That's like the pin factory. That's like Jack and Jill in the pin factory. What's more interesting is this idea of a comparative advantage, and that trade can still produce good results for everybody if countries produce in things in which they don't actually have an absolute advantage, but only a comparative advantage. So the country has a comparative advantage if and only if it can produce that commodity more cheaply in terms of another commodity whose production it must give up, the opportunity cost. One country's got a comparative advantage in bean production if it must forego less corn production to produce a ton of beans than the other one. So let's look at an example. In this case, hither has a comparative advantage in both corn and beans, 6-1 and 3-2. Okay, so sorry, not comparative, an absolute advantage in both corn and beans, right? So here and here. But it turns out, in fact, that Yon has a comparative advantage in beans. So let's see how that comes about. For hither to produce a ton of beans, to produce 3 tons of beans, it has to give up 6 tons of corn. So to produce 1 ton of beans, it has to give up a half a ton of corn. No, sorry, it has to give up 2 tons of corn. Pardon me, 3 to 6. For hither to produce beans, it has to give up 2 tons of corn. Let's write that here. For Yon to produce a ton of beans, it only has to give up half a ton of corn, because it can produce 2 per acre of beans and only 1 per acre of corn. So the cost to Yon of producing beans in terms of corn, and that's what really matters here, is only a half. So it turns out that even though hither has the absolute advantage in both corn and beans, Yon has the comparative advantage in one of those products. And in any situation like this, Ricardo's law of comparative advantage says that there are terms of trade under which both countries can profit from the trade. Not just that the aggregate is better, but bigger, but the aggregate in each country is going to be bigger. And you can see this if you just look through a little example like this. Here's hither, okay, and it faces a choice. It can produce either 6 tons of corn on an acre of ground, or it can produce 3 tons of bean. We've just, on this example, this is totally arbitrary, but I made it up because it works. The terms of trade are 1-to-1, 1 ton of corn for 1 ton of beans. So if hither produces 6 tons of corn and then trades them 1-to-1 with Yon, then then hither will have 6 tons of beans, but if it produces them itself, it'll only have 3. Okay, so you can see how hither, which has the comparative advantage, can actually still gain by trade. Let's check and make sure that yon can also gain. So yon can produce either 1 ton of corn or 2 tons of beans on the acre of ground. If it produces the 2 tons of beans and then trades them 1-to-1 with home, it's going to end up with 2 tons of corn. If it just produces the corn itself, it's only got 1. So in both cases, each country can profit, even though hither has the absolute advantage in both. There's a range of terms of trades under which this will work. That's important because there's a range of terms of trade, and not all of them are going to be as fair as they might be. Okay, so this is how Ricardo's law comes up. Each country faces the choice of either producing something itself or trading, and as long as there's a comparative advantage, it's going to be able to trade with profit. So this means that both countries can gain. Both of them can gain from free trade. There's going to be a higher overall supply, and this applies under conditions of both absolute and comparative advantage. So even though the United States is better at producing cars and corn than India, it can still gain. But now this is the important thing. This argument says that the aggregate in each country will be higher, but it says nothing about what happens to the distribution of the gains from trade. And as I'll show you in the next segment, this is an important consideration. So here's a little test question. Per acre of land, country P can produce 5 times more cotton than Q and 2 times more wool. So country P has an absolute advantage in cotton and in wool. Which of the following is true? Pause the video and think for a moment, and I will come back and discuss it with you. All right, this may be a little easier to see if the answer is going to turn out to be B. I'm going to tell you the answer first, and then I'm going to show you why, because I have another slide to do it with. All right. Which one has the comparative advantage in, I'm saying that P has a comparative advantage over Q in cotton, and Q has a comparative advantage in P in wool. So let's go down and check that last one. Okay, for Q to produce wool, it has to give the yield is 1. Let's say that it's 5-to-1 and 2-to-1. So Q's yield is 1, and so to give up, and it could use that same amount of land to produce cotton. So the cost of producing wool in terms of cotton is 1. Okay, what is the cost to P of producing wool? Well, it can use that land to produce wool and get 2 tons. It can use that land to produce cotton and get 5 tons. So the cost in terms of cotton, the wool in terms of cotton, is actually 5 divided by 2, which is 2.5. All right, and so their country with the comparative advantage turns out to be Q. Right, so that's the answer as I mentioned. All right, so that completes the discussion of this economic utilitarian justification, which says that in aggregate, both countries will profit from free trade. And that seems like a good reason for free trade. Okay, good economic reason, a good economic utilitarian reason. The question is going to be about distribution, and we're going to turn to that in the next segment.